Thank you both so much for being here. I mean, clearly, this is such an important topic at this point, and we couldn't imagine speaking to two people who could shed light on where we've been, where we are, and how to get to where we need to go. So thank you so much. I'd love for the both of you to introduce yourselves and tell people a little bit about you.
President first, please. Christian, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Julie. Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm Christian F. Nunes. I'm the National President for the National Organization for Women, and extremely excited to be here with all of you today for this conference, the New York State Conference. And I'll turn it over to Julie.
Hello, my name is Julie Kay. I'm a lawyer and a co-author of Controlling Women, which Sonia nicely has in her background as well. It's a book that Catherine Colbert, the attorney who argued Planned Parenthood versus Casey and co-founded the Center for Reproductive Rights, and I wrote, was released last July, and sort of in anticipation of where we are now. And I'm delighted to be here today. I'm a second generation feminist and longtime now supporter, and now the mother of two growing feminists and things. So I'm just really pleased to be having this discussion, and how now has approached this issue as a real reproductive freedom and a human right.
Thank you so much. I thought we could start off with, everybody's familiar with what's happened in Texas, but just last week, Ohio decided to introduce its own abortion ban, HB 480. It's a total ban on all abortions. And like Texas, it has that component for incentivizing citizen vigilantes. Should the women's movement focus on strategies to save Roe v. Wade in the Supreme Court? Or should we be planning for a post-Roe America? Either one of you.
I'll start. As Carol Gilligan would have said, that, you know, when women are given a question of either or, we're allowed to say both. So I would like to say both. As we say in the book, don't put our ovum all in one basket. I think it is really important work that's being done at the Supreme Court level by the Center for Reproductive Rights and Planned Parenthood and the ACLU, doing some top-notch legal work. But we're a big movement. There are a lot of us out there, and we need to recognize that we're going to lose our rights under Roe, and we need to start working now for the next stage of this post-Roe world.
So you feel very certain about that?
Unfortunately, I do. I mean, as we say, it's, you know, it's all about the votes at the Supreme Court and getting to 5. And, you know, with the 3 Trump appointed justices who are vehemently anti-abortion, we don't have the votes to do anything forward thinking or positive to expand reproductive freedom. And moreover, they're very likely to completely eradicate Roe, at least, if not with this upcoming case out of Mississippi, then fairly soon after.
I think I'm going to just add on to Julie's saying, but I think that for me, I think it also starts before Supreme Court, being that a lot of this is happening at the state, you know, our local and state levels. What we're seeing is, you know, state legislature pass these really horrific laws and bills, and that's what eventually has to get to Supreme Court to be overturned. And so when we're talking about this, I think that it's extremely important that we are strategizing at the local and state level, and that's going to be super important for keeping the key to moving forward. I think a lot of times, you know, before we even have to, we have to fight, and we have to think about our courts, and I think we have to talk about expanding the courts, expanding Supreme Court. But we also need to talk about how to become more proactive and offensive in our strategies to prevent these bills from getting passed, so that they don't contribute to a post-Roe, because we are seeing that right now. And we have to look at how do we start electing more elected officials who represent what we're standing for, who have our value systems, who are going to fight for reproductive justice and reproductive rights. Not only training those candidates, but also training you know, the people who are running their campaigns, their campaign operatives, who are going to make sure they understand the value systems and thinking about it beyond, you know, so that we can have a whole, complete, holistic approach to how we're looking forward at this. And I also want to say that I think it's really important that we're looking at things like our school boards and our city councils. It's not just state legislator, because these schools are the ones who are also seeing that they're not going to make sure that they don't have sex education or reproductive justice education, and city councils and the ordinances they pass. All these have a play into what leads up to these restrictive laws and ordinances and bills that we are then fighting for now at the Supreme Court. So I think it starts at the local and state level, so that we are not having to have as many fights as we go forward to the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know, in all the conversation about the viability of Roe v. Wade, it has opened the conversation for more people to recognize and talk about and strategize around the fact that we've been losing access year after year for years now. And so for many women, and you know, it's a point that young women make, is that how much has Roe been doing for us, this federal protection? Because there have just been at the state level so many rollbacks, and access is just horrendous for so many women around the country. Now we know that if or when Roe is overturned, that we have these trigger laws that are ready to go into effect, that, you know, more than 20 states will ban abortion. So that work at that state level needs to happen now. I was talking with someone who, you know, we realized that they were not born, they're post-Roe, that not even their mother was born after Roe v. Wade. So it's a different environment for a lot of younger women, but I think it gives a lot of opportunity to really move forward. Yeah. And also to talk about all the racial dynamics that we now talk about, reproductive justice, how important all of that is. I don't know if either of you have had conversations with younger women or have any thoughts on how this is really an opportunity to take this in a different direction.
Yeah, I think, Sonia, I mean, that's kind of the point of, you know, where we need to be now. There are solutions. First of all, recognizing, as you said, you know, since 1992 and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and even before then, states have been putting restrictions on abortion rights. And it's exactly what Christian says. It's these red-leaning states who are scrambling all over each other to show that they are the most anti-abortion legislatures. And, you know, that, you know, Ohio is what we call a copycat state. Let's take the worst that Texas is doing and, you know, show that we can do the same or even one up them. So we need to, you know, really recognize how restricted rights are right now, and particularly for anyone who's marginalized in this country. So for teens to get access to abortion, they have additional hurdles, for women in rural areas, for low-income women. And we're seeing these restrictions disproportionately affect women of color because of this structural racial inequality in access to healthcare. And as you said, Sonia, we're all getting more aware of it. It's been a lot of people's lived experience, unfortunately, but I think that in this past year with COVID and looking at how there have been such disparities in access to healthcare overall, that's something that those of us looking at access to abortion have been well aware of for a while. And that when you throw in a ban on Medicaid funding for abortion under the Hyde Amendment, it's even worse. But I think the important thing to remember is that the federal government, the Supreme Court, can set the floor for rights, not the ceiling. So we are going to enter into some kind of dark times with these trigger laws, with about 20 plus states that are going to try to make abortion completely illegal. So we're going to have to try to stop those states. And we're also going to have to look at the blue states like New York and really sort of up our game in supporting women and people who are traveling for abortions, and really looking at, how we can be active in our own state and also nationwide, because these are fundamental human rights, to make decisions about when and whether and with whom to have children or to not have children. And we want all women to be able to make that choice. I mean, there's two sides of a coin that Roe lets us, supported the choice to have an abortion, to have a pregnancy. And we want those to both be legitimate choices for every person who finds themselves in that situation.
And Go ahead, Christian.
Oh, no, I totally think Julie hit it right on the nail on the head. I mean, it's just absolutely, I think it's going to call on the blue states to really step up, and figure out ways that they can help strategize and be important in supporting these states where they're seeing these most restrictive laws. And the marginalized communities that are most affected, because they're going to need every support they possibly can have. I just want to add that in there. So, but I think she really hit it on the head when she said that. So.
Yeah, and that was going to be one of my questions, but we might as well tackle that now. The activism on the ground in red states, is brisk and robust, but frankly, in New York, at times we feel a little helpless. Yes, we can contribute to the funds to help people travel. But what more can we do, those of us who are in states like New York? New York is very safe. One of the things that Now worked on here and the other reproductive rights groups for several years is to make sure to codify it in our state constitution. We have started even funds, government funds, to be able to help people get the abortion care that they need. So what are some of the actual things, tactical things that either Now is working on, or Julie, that you've seen other groups and organizations work on that we could consider here in New York?
If I could just talk about the grassroots part about it real quick. I think one of the things that has been great, and I always say this is what, every chaos, every tragedy, there's triumph that comes out of it. And with the pandemic, I think the ability for us to learn how to connect better came out of that, right? We've learned how to figure out ways to connect across this world quicker, faster, create ways to provide services and socially, electronically. And I think also the grassroots in our social media activism has improved on a whole new level than ways we had before. And so I think when we're talking about what's happening right now, what states like New York can do in advancing our rights and access across this country is mobilize virtually, get together with these red states who are suffering, find out ways to provide virtual phone banks to get information out to them, ask them what they need, help them get the information, help them provide resources. All this can be done virtually, where you don't even have to leave your state. You can help find out the organizations, connect with those BIPOC-led groups who are really working with marginalized communities, immigrant communities, BIPOC organizations who are the most affected by these laws, and communities and poverty, stricken communities, and talk to them about the resources that they need and how to organize transportation, how to organize your funds to get them to places to get abortions if they needed. All this can be things that your state can help organize and connect with these people on the levels they need to be. So I would say those are the things that you definitely can do that can be very effective and helpful.
Yeah, I would agree. I think Christian and I are a good balance for this panel. I think communities have to decide what fits and what works for them. In the book, we talk about a lot of different kind of solutions and political activism, legislative as well as electoral. And the real message is you have to find something that works for you. I loved it, Sonia, when you said, bring some of your besties and start a chapter, because this work, if it's going to be sustainable, it has to be something that fits for all of us and what we can do. So I think getting politically active is so important, electing those officials who, as we said, are going to be, champions for us. They're not just going to tick the box of, yes, of course I'm pro-choice, but they're really going to be leaders. I know Attorney General Tish James is coming on later, and she's shown how you can work both in New York and also nationally. She's been a leader on this issue with briefing and amicus and working with other attorney generals. There are, I think, so many different positive things that Now is doing in New York. Clinic defense and escorting is always something that's needed, even in our wonderfully blue state. And supporting women who are going to be traveling. As you noted, it's not just private philanthropy and funds, it's also in New York City giving money to the funds. It's public funding, it's Medicaid funds for people who are traveling for abortion services. It's trying to have more access to medication abortion through one of the things that I talk about in the book is that all of these minute clinic, doc in a box kind of urgent care centers that set up during COVID could be doing medication abortion. Maybe that's something, I don't want to set the agenda, but I love having greater access to medication abortion. California, our other enormous blue friend on the West Coast, has passed a law that I think goes into effect the next year, where university healthcare, public university healthcare services provide medication abortion. We have a history of training physicians to do surgical abortions in the state, but maybe we need to expand the basis for medication abortion. And then, I think also as important is to keep our allyship up around immigrant rights for people who need access to healthcare. I think the paid family leave and low-wage worker protections, particularly for pregnant women, are really important. And then the last one I would add in that I think is vital is New York's efforts to look at why we have such a horrific disparity in maternal mortality rates. We have some of the best healthcare in the world here, and yet Black women are dying in pregnancy and childbirth at 4 times the rate of white women. And even, the rates are just too high. So we need to look at sort of this full 360 of what it means to have really good healthcare and how we can be a model for the rest of the country, because at some point, I think our country will be bluer and they're going to be looking for good policies and examples that work. And I'm proud to be a New Yorker and have something to show for the rest of the country to hopefully model.
That makes me think about, hearing you talk about this, it's this pivot from we've always fought for reproductive rights, what Roe is based on the right to privacy. But really what we're talking about now in this conversation, you really see the developing of it, talking about it as a human right. That seems very, very like a great opportunity moving forward, especially with young women that we have talked about who, for them, the urgent issues in front of them at this moment are climate change, voting rights, racial equality. It fits in nicely with everything that is going on now. Is that how you see it as well, either of you? A pivot away from privacy rights to it being a human right?
Absolutely. I think the reason that we all know why abortion matters is it doesn't fit with this privacy right model, which was developed sort of in 1973 in a very narrow legal framework. It's always been about equality. And I think, we know it's about human rights. It's about participation in society, freed from discrimination and bodily integrity and dignity. It's something that the reproductive justice movement leaders have been talking about for decades. I know Loretta Ross, has been a real leader on this. I learned a lot from her about it decades ago now. And then when I was in Ireland and working in the international sphere in countries that have signed on to actual documents, it was a language that was really effective for getting people to realize what's at stake here. And I think that that's something that we can all start talking about this much more aggressively and assertively as a human right. I mean, this isn't about a religious dispute. This isn't about philosophically when life begins. This is really about our ability to live with equality and gender equity. And really, the human rights model also has much more space for the intersectionality of women's lives, with racial equality or inequality, and gender equality and inequality. So I'm a big fan of just adopting a human rights framework in every time we speak about this issue.
Yeah,
Are you
I absolutely agree with Julie. Once again, Julie's like right on. We're on the same wavelength today, Julie. But I think when you mentioned the intersectional approach to seeing things, we live in an ecosystem. We don't live in like these silos. And so when we're talking about privacy, privacy works for some, right? But for those who can afford abortion and abortion care, privacy is you know, it's a little bit easier to just talk in that silo of just privacy, but it really isn't. It's really about human rights. It is really about dignity and respect. It's about, you know, understanding how intersections of different people's lives work and how they contribute to their narrative, and how that affects their reproductive health and their rights. It tells their whole story, really, how as a person, as a being. And also how racial justice plays into it as well. And privacy really doesn't take those things into consideration. So we have to be able to look at how all these things go into play. Who can afford to be able to travel? Who can afford to take time off of work? Who can afford to get childcare? And who has access to all those things, right? Especially I can't even say we're post-COVID. We're still in the mix of COVID, right? But we're getting at the she session as well. And when women are the ones who've been most affected by that, most frontline workers, most farm workers, most restaurant workers, hotel workers, but also are having to take off of work because they don't have access, or we don't have paid family medical leave, and we don't have childcare. And I mean, there's so many other dynamics we look at. We don't talk about those things. It goes way beyond privacy. And so it's really, we can't really limit it to just talk about privacy when we're not talking about the inequalities that exist because of systems of oppression and systematic racism that's been built into our institutions and our systems in the United States. So we have to be willing to have a discussion about human rights and civil rights and the ecosystems that we live in and how those all affect ourselves as human beings and women.
And can I just add just the sort of lawyerly piece of the nice part about the human rights model versus the constitutional model is the constitutional model is sort of a right to be free from, live free or die, free from restrictions on your rights. It's from a constitution that in no way was designed to protect women's rights or to have racial equity. I mean, we were just not on the list of top protections when it was framed. And if you look at the human rights model, which was really developed a lot more after World War II, of looking at what went so horribly wrong, where did the government fail? And it's much more proactive in sort of establishing a level of government responsibility to provide a floor for things like housing, for things like food security, education, free from discrimination. It's a much more powerful model and one that aligns much more with our values. It's something that, particularly the far right is rightfully scared of and tries to paint as sort of some, crazy radical, it will, cause the downfall. But when we look at countries that have adopted a much more human rights approach, those are the ones that are always getting the top grades when we're looking at who has paid family leave, who has more women elected to office. I don't think those countries do a lot better than us on racial equity, but I think that they are much more looking at where and how you can have the government remove barriers to access to basic human needs.
Well, what you both have articulated is really inspiring for a way to talk about and reach more people, because we know that we need to, right? I mean, we know that the majority of voters do believe in a person's right to terminate a pregnancy. However, it's not the number 1, 2, or 3 thing on their list of priorities. It's really down on the list, as opposed to those who are anti-choice. That issue is they're very passionate about. So they've made a great deal of progress. But this message, I think, really resonates and is a very exciting way to move forward. And Christian, have you found, as you are articulating this vision, that it is resonating with now members? I mean, you travel the country, you are certainly talking to a lot of people.
I think that it's mixed. I think that historically people have are so used to old language, that sometimes it's a shift. But I think people do want to move in the way of human rights. I think we all believe in them and we buy into them. And I think it's a way of just shifting our language to understand these are what we already value. And these are the things that we already are promoting. So I think it's just a shift in the way we speak about it. But I think overall we already buy into these values or we wouldn't be in this fight. You know, it's kind of like we are already invested in this. This is why we're here. This is why we're fighting. I think sometimes it's just learning how we shift our messaging and our language about it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think, Sonia, you hit the nail on the head earlier when you're talking about bringing young people into the movement. I think, graduating from nursery school when Roe was passed. I don't think it's something that people take for granted. I think that they have been hoodwinked into thinking it's safe. And we need to change that message. We need to stop saying save Roe, and really look more broadly and, bringing in allies. We've, in the book, we look a lot at the Black Lives Matter movement and the marriage equality movement, and how those communities really brought in a wide range of allies and taught people how to be good allies in their movement building. And I think it's time for us in the reproductive freedom movement to bring in more men. This is not all about men, but they should be standing up with us. This is a basic human right, and they should be our allies. We need to recognize more and talk more about the connections with LGBTQ plus rights and non-binary folks' rights, and really start expanding our base. We need to be good partners to those movements as well. But really looking at, telling people, like, this is a fundamental human right to me. This is about my rights. This is about everybody's rights of women, people who can get pregnant. And this is something that has been threatened like never before. And so it's time, if you can give, a story of what the world was like before abortion was legalized to a grandchild, or if you can listen to what their experience is now. I think those kinds of cross-generational allyships are important, and reaching out to other movements and really being much more demanding of our rights now.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add too that one thing I think we also have to recognize is that the other party has been winning with kitchen table politics, right? And that's what they've been winning with. And everyone keeps saying, why do white women keep voting for Trump, like our Trumpsters or these conservatives, or this just like, why do they keep pulling more and more and more? And we have to look at the strategy that they're using to this fear tap, or what's getting them to the values that they're using. This is kitchen table politics that they're using to make their values appear comfortable, and to make them seem like they're in line with the values. And it's not that we need to stop talking about our values. We need to get them to understand that our values, in a lot of ways, are their values too. And talking in reproductive rights in a way, and let them know that it affects everyone, like Julie's saying. And that really we all know somebody who's had an abortion, and we love them, right? And they're important to us, and we have value for them in our lives. And if we can relate this message in a way that makes it a value for them and is digestible for them, and tells them that their value, they really do have a value that's invested in the rights for their loved ones, I think that also can help us win. But we have to start talking and messaging in a way that is showing our values in a place where people get it for that group. So it's like when we message, we have to understand who we're messaging to. We don't have to convince, it's like they say, why are you trying to convince the people who are already convinced? We don't need to do that, right? It's really like, how do we message and talk a way where we can tell people that these are the really values that are existing. You want, you were affected by this. And I believe I'm totally in agreement with the allies, and men too. And men are affected by reproductive rights as well. And so, someone's affected by this, and you're affected by this. And so we need to all be supporting this cause. And this is why. And I think those are the other important things we need to make sure that we're doing in this movement.
Thank you so much. Before we move too far away from that question about how can those of us in blue states work nationally and help our sisters in red states, we've touched on some, but I want to make sure that we really cover everything. And I actually have a question in the chat, Julie, about medication abortions, and it's particularly about what role can the American Medical Association play in supporting Roe v. Wade and pushing forward the abortion pills at pharmacies and such. So if you have any thoughts on that, that would be great. And Christian, from our perspective from now is, the political work on the ground. You are doing amazing things at National Now and have started programs on teaching chapters how to really up their game with all types of skill building, as well as programs for women who are running for office. And beyond that, as you mentioned briefly,
right,
those women and people who want to support the right candidates, to build the teams around the candidates so that they can win. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And, the whole remote world that we're living in, doesn't that give us an opportunity? I mean, we've all now been doing the virtual phone banking since certainly, so certainly had our phones pressed to our ears in 2016 and then in the midterms quite a bit. But can we come together in remote meetings, Zooms, with groups of people here, groups of friends with groups of friends in other places? Just any additional thoughts on that continued effort to be able to reach across state lines and help others?
Sure. I will share about what NOW's been doing and what we're still going to be planning for as we go toward the midterms. So for those who don't know, we launched Run Now in this year, 2021, which is our program where we partner with other organizations to help train feminist candidates and operatives, those who don't want to be a candidate but want to run campaigns for those feminist candidates. And we partner with organizations that are already in existence who've been doing this work for a very long time. So we're not trying to recreate the wheel, but we're trying to partner so that we can help put out more feminist candidates to run for office and elect more feminist candidates, so they do have our core issues and our values in place. So we have partners like Emerge, Emily's List, Speak Easy, all kinds of other groups that we're partnering with, and we continue to build partnerships. And then they actually come and they will train our members on different things, from campaign finance to stump speech to organizing, creating your platform, all the different components you need for running for office. And then for those who want to actually just run a campaign, be campaign managers, there's a whole track for that as well. Because some of us, I think typical now, we like to be behind the scenes as organizers. So there's a whole track for that. And that's pretty good. And our goal is really to work to get as many women and allies trained by the end of 2022 to really also put people on campaigns for the midterms. And the other one we're really excited about is our Organizing for Justice boot camp, where we are trying to help retrain our members to be active organizers in their states, because we know we have a lot of organizing that needs to happen as we see these laws happening and things that are happening in your communities. So we partner with Midwest Academy, who will be providing these trainings, and they have been providing. We've had 2 so far. We have some more coming in January. And then from that group, we're going to train some trainers who could then go out through the communities and train, and they'll be doing them virtually. And we're going to be training some organizing some state organizers who we can position. So when we have major things happening, we can just call on and mobilize and convene as needed when we have these big things happening, like abortion, access we need it to fight for, or the voter suppression things happening. So these are things that are all benefits available to NOW members at no cost. It's just, you just look online, sign up for the training, and we'll be sending out member notifications for them. But these are all ways of things you can do virtually that can help you be more active in your states, as well as help you with other organizations that are going through things.
I think that's fabulous. I often feel like I'm sort of preaching to the choir, and today I feel like I'm preaching to the army. Just as I know everybody on here who's committed to, coming today is an activist, because this is a way of being active. And I think that education piece and the training is so important, because that will make a difference. It's about getting involved in other states as well and being qualified to do it. I was just thinking, when we're talking about women getting elected, especially Governor Hochul, I once had the pleasure of hearing her talk about when she first ran and juggling childcare. We're all in a slightly different era now, with COVID, because you can't hide your kids as much because they burst into the background and everything else. But we've also seen the She Session and how much of a struggle it is, and how single mothers apparently have been hit even the hardest. Like, finally, that actual data is coming out to support what we already knew intrinsically. So I just want to, piggyback on again of the training and getting involved in other states. You can do postcards from home. You can do so much from home right now. Where also New York is very close to some states that aren't so blue. And I'm sure I'm not the only one on this call that has seen a lot of Philadelphia during the various other elections. It's quite easy to kind of, go and volunteer on the ground in these elections. And I want to address the question about medication abortion also. So what people probably know is it's a series of pills that you take before 11 weeks of pregnancy. It's very safe. It's right now in some countries, it's available either remotely or for self-induced abortion. We have a lot of regulations in this country that have been placed upon medication abortion that are medically unnecessary, that are more driven by politics than good health. President Biden did have direct the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, to lift some of those during the pandemic. How you access the actual pill is still difficult. It varies by state a bit. There are both, I think, legal and more gray area ways of accessing abortion medication. One organization called Aid Access, which is an outgrowth of the Women on Waves abortion ship, which I was fortunate enough to participate in Ireland. It was a project where in countries where abortion was illegal, they would literally bring a ship into port. The idea was that women and people seeking abortions could get on board, go out into international waters 12 miles away out at sea, be handed the pill legally, because they would be flying under a Dutch flag where abortion was legal, come back into port. They would be supported with a doctor, and they knew that the medication they were getting was reliable. Aid Access, which started as Women on Web, has kind of continued that. If they have reliable medication that they ship through the mail, they have a doctor and things available online. It's not ideal. I would rather that everybody could go, to a clinician, even to a general practitioner, and get the medication, or to a mid-level provider. This is not complicated medically, and it's very safe. But the reality is, as we enter into this next stage, and even where we are now, we have to be open to supporting women in all kinds of different situations, and do for them the best that we can as far as getting actual abortion services. And there'll be a different role for lots of different people. And some people will feel more comfortable, doing things that are more gray area of the law. Others will really want to work to help women and people who are traveling to access medication abortion. I'm not sure I answered your question, Sonia, but that was kind of, I wanted to sort of explain a little bit more about medication abortion and making it more available. I think it's also one of the things that's quite different about when Roe goes away, that pre-Roe medication abortion was not available, and women really did risk their lives and their health and their fertility to access abortion, and they were exploited a lot. I mean, there were some groups of that were organized groups of feminists, the Jane Collective, the clergy, groups that would help people to access illegal abortion, but there was a lot of risk involved. And I think now with medication abortion, we're looking at greater access with less risk, not for everyone, and certainly not for after 11 weeks of pregnancy, but it is a very positive medical development that's happened in the past couple of decades.
But Julie, what are the laws surrounding that? Is there?
So
and as you speak, as you're talking about it, I realize, well, isn't that going to be the next thing that anti-choice movement and activists and legislators try to restrict?
Yes, and it's already been happening. The medication abortion has already been subjected to unnecessary restrictions. Where abortion is outright illegal, medication abortion is banned as well. Texas has a law, I think, coming into play December 1st that was kind of to try to cut access to medication abortion even further. And then it depends on the state laws, how, the more access we can have to telemedicine, the better. If, New York State allows you to have abortion medication distributed by telemedicine, somebody has to get kind of just over the border and into the state. It's the interplay of state and federal law. We could have even fewer restrictions if the FDA was willing to sort of make that COVID permission permanent. And I know even like in New York State, there are other hurdles involved to getting access to medication abortion, like what kind of, do you need a blood test beforehand and those kinds of things. We need to make sure it's safe, but we also want to encourage every state to sort of have, access through telemedicine and keep abortion in that sort of category of other kinds of medication that is, at the same level of risk. But that never happens with abortion services. We've been living with what are called trap laws in a lot of red states and some purple states for a number of years. Those are targeted laws at abortion providers, and they require things like similar to what you would require of an ambulatory surgical center, that you have to have a certain width of hallway and you have to have all these kinds of backups for a procedure that is fundamentally safe. I mean, it's safer than a colonoscopy, and yet these same states are not requiring outpatient services that provide colonoscopies to provide that same level of kind of overkill on facilities that they're requiring in abortion clinics. So it's more part of the sort of harassment and restriction, and to try to make it harder for women and people seeking abortions.
There was a question related to what you just introduced about facilities that I'll go ahead and ask now, since you've started to talk about them. The question is, there's a whole infrastructure that has been built up to assist low-income women access abortion, but this has the negative impact of separating abortion care from the healthcare system in some ways. How can we destigmatize and reintegrate abortion care into our everyday care?
That's an excellent question, and a sort of more top level question, I think, which I'm not surprised from this group of chat. Going back to when Roe, became the law of the land, and feminists worked hard to set up clinics and these kind of, safe spaces that were very focused on reproductive health care and that were focused on women's health care specifically. And it has had somewhat of a silo effect. I don't blame that effort in any way, because I think abortion is either going to be kind of siloed or non-existent. It's not like these other facilities and medical facilities are looking to reach out and help provide abortion services. I think the mainstream medical profession has been very glad to not have to deal with this issue. I encourage everyone on this call to ask their healthcare provider, do you offer medication abortion? If not, why not? Sometimes it's an insurance question. I think that's something that needs some activism around it to change the insurance regulations, or what they're allowed to get away with in this state and in the country. I think it's how we bring abortion into mainstream medicine is we work more closely with medical schools. We demand more of the medical profession. And I think that a lot of these clinics have really developed a nice specialized practice that's not just abortion and contraception, but really looking at mental health care, physical health care, becoming more hubs for gender-based care, becoming more sensitive to the needs of LGBTQ plus people in their medical needs, and overall destigmatizing the care. I feel like there are probably people on this call who are way more versed in the medical system and what the best way forward is in New York. And I wish, to learn more about, the pros and cons. We want to keep clinics, we want to keep a separate space, but we also want to have care more widely available and more integrated. So I think that really presents the question of the tension in that.
Right, there's just so many issues around that. I mean, with the consolidation of hospitals and healthcare under the Catholic Church, I mean, abortion has just gone out the window. I mean, we've seen that um, constricting over a long period of time. I mean, we've heard the horror stories of women who have been in having a C-section, and rather than while they're on the operating table having their tubes tied, whatever the case may be, having to undergo a second surgery at another time. I mean, that is a
Or
human
never
right.
getting it. I mean, I think that's what happens more often, is that it just, we're missing an opportunity.
And one of the comments or questions in the chat, Christian, I'll direct this to you, is someone who belongs to a group of women who had illegal abortions pre-Roe v. Wade. We are telling our stories to as many young people as we can. Do you believe that telling our stories is essential to educating younger women? How do we expand our reach virtually?
Absolutely. I think it's absolutely important to tell your stories. I mean, I'm big on storytelling as a way of learning and activism. And I think it's really effective because, it's interesting that, I think sometimes the media tries to portray these horrible stories and inaccurate stories sometimes, and they don't really fully give the truth. And some stories are horrible and some stories are very traumatic. So I don't want to minimize that experience either, but I think it's good for women to tell their own narratives and share their own narratives. And so I think it's important for that to be shared. I know there are a couple organizations that have storytelling, and they do have women come in, and there's one based out of Texas that does it. So I think that for these women, it would be great if they formed their own group and attended different events, rallies, and were participating to be able to tell their stories. I know I cannot think of the name of the group that has attended, it's gone to a couple different rallies in Supreme Court, and they've gotten up and shared their stories about their abortions and different things, their own experiences. But I think it's very effective to do that. And even, even with now, it might be something where, we can work with you all to be able to share those stories, through different things that we're doing with our own membership. But I think that just making sure that you're getting your stories out there and attending as many events where you can have your story heard is really important. And connecting with organizations that have the storytelling, I think, is really effective. And I will try to remember that name, and I will pass it to Sonia when I remember the name of the group that does the storytelling. They are a group, and they have all the women to come in, and they go around all over the country and tell their stories. But I'll try to remember the name once I can think of it, and I'll pass it on to Sonia.
I mean, there certainly has been a sea change in that. There was a time when it was so deeply stigmatized and taboo to talk about abortion in general, and certainly to talk about your personal experiences. But like sexual assault, it is out in the open much more today. And I do think that has had a big impact in humanizing us as people, and why it's important, and why we have a right to determine our own lives.
And I will say, I think that's something that's at risk too, that if Roe, or when Roe is taken away and when abortion is criminalized, we can't underestimate the stigma that puts on abortion. And I lived in Ireland for a number of years when there was an absolute ban on abortion. It was a provision in their constitution that was put in their constitution in response to the threat of Roe v. Wade, and as well as sort of some political maneuverings and bargaining with the Catholic Church. And women still had abortions. They traveled to England and to Spain. It was called the Irish solution to the Irish problem. And so they didn't have the kind of maternal mortality or incidents and deaths that we had pre-Roe, but they had the shame and the stigma and the cost and the disruption and the lack of healthcare, because when women came back from traveling, they didn't want to tell their doctors or their families. And so we have to keep speaking out and keep normalizing abortion, that it's, 1 in 4 women have an abortion in their lifetime. Over half of these people are parents already. And so these are decisions that people make that control their lives, their very most intimate decisions. And we need to be aware of not stigmatizing, of not judging. And so that's what happens when abortion gets criminalized also. It's, it gets a taint on it that is very, very hard to remove. And so the more we talk about this as a human right, as a right to healthcare, as a right to bodily integrity, and to be free from discrimination and free from having others make your, essential core decisions about how you'll live your life, whether you'll get access to work and to education, the more we frame it like that, the more it becomes the way that people understand this issue. And then we can make it kind of the wedge issue that the far right has. I mean, I think, Sonia, your point about people not voting, not putting it up number 1 on their reasons that they're voting for somebody is something that we need to change. And people will do that as we start telling them more and more how important this issue is.
As we're talking about culture and stigma and taboo, I'd like to ask the question about, how we're talking about reproductive rights in terms of using the word woman these days. I mean, just recently, we certainly saw the ACLU was in the news for taking an RBG quote on reproductive rights and replacing women with the word people. We had on the latest cover of the Lancet, the medical journal, they describe women as bodies with vaginas. And about a story that said historically the anatomy and physiology of bodies with vaginas have been neglected. So ironically, about the neglect. So it's really important to be inclusive, and transgender rights are so important. And I'm so glad that they're in the forefront. I know for myself, the first transgender people I ever met were at the National Now conferences. It might have been years before I actually got to know someone, sit in a room and talk about resolutions and have lunch with them. So for now, this has always been inclusive. And so I understand it's very inclusive. And the point is to recognize that not every single person who is pregnant identifies as a woman. Very, very important. But my question is, do you see any negative consequences? Are there negative consequences to avoiding using the word woman, either for individual women or for the movement for reproductive rights?
I'll start. I wrote a book called Controlling Women. So I had a lot of that conversation with my co-author and with our editors. And, my co-author, especially as a lesbian woman who had children well before that was the thing that anybody in a same-sex couple did. And I agree, the value of inclusivity is so important. And, we're not going to get there unless we change the way we speak. But I do think that we need to balance that with my belief that restrictions on abortion are about controlling sexuality. They're about really promoting very traditional gender biases and gender stereotypes of men as breadwinners and women as childbearers and caretakers. That was sort of the play on words that we did with Controlling Women, because we do think this is about controlling one's sexuality. And so I think it's important to always remember that when we're talking about these issues, about where this is coming from, the history of misogyny in our country, and even well before our country was a country. I tend to say that it's about women seeking abortions and people seeking abortions, because I don't want to lose talking about this as a women's rights issue, but I do want to be inclusive. Again, my kind of have your cake and eat it too, both. I think it's important, and non-binary folks and transgender folks and others are so much a part of our movement and are part of who is trying to be controlled, who is stigmatized and ostracized and subject to violence and exclusion for these same kinds of attempts to perpetuate gender norms and to keep, pink and blue onesies from the day a baby is born. So I like to try to have I think a conversation that includes both an acknowledgement that this is a deeply held women's rights feminist issue, but that also affects many people's lives who don't fit into a non-binary, into the binary, or are trying to address care and get health care and live free from discrimination themselves.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Julie on this. I think that too often people want us to choose either or, like we have to make a choice, like it's either this or that. And I don't think we have to always do that. I think when we're talking about being inclusive, sometimes people get confused about inclusion as well, and they want to start doing erasure. And erasure is not inclusivity, it's very different. And to be inclusive means that we're bringing everyone in. We're including everyone, how they identify. And we can do that. And so I want us to be very clear about this. So being inclusive, we're including everyone, how they identify, every transgender, non-conforming, cisgender, however you identify your gender. If you identify as a woman, you're a woman. And I also very much agree that this fight we're having right now is very much about controlling women's bodies. I want us to be very cognizant that as we're moving through this, that we want to be inclusive, but we don't want to have erasure of women in the process of doing this. So we can do both. We can be inclusive. We can include all those who are affected and a part of the reproductive movement and also part of the abortion process. But we also do not want to erase women, because the women have been fighting the battle of being erased for centuries. So we don't want to go back to erasing women in the process of trying to be inclusive. So that's what I would say.
Thank you
I
both.
like erasure. I think that's a great way to put it. That's going to stick in my head. Of demanding women, controlling women, never erased women.
Exactly. And I'm just going to, we've got a couple minutes left. There's just it's such a hearty discussion, and I know that there's going to be a lot to unpack after it. I just want to acknowledge a couple of the comments and thoughts that came through and questions in the chat. One from our dear friend Mary Lou, who's been on the front lines fighting for reproductive rights and who worked side by side with Now here in New York to develop a clinic escort program. Yes, those things, as you said, Julie, are still needed here in New York. But she says we need to be persistent and passionate about why we need this right and access to it. And that, yes, it's about controlling women's lives, denying a woman's right to autonomy to decide if and when they will have children. But she also wants to encourage us not to capitulate and make sure that we are fighting with all our guns and barrels to make sure to save Roe and to do all the things that we've talked about here to help those in red states and to press forward with human rights approach to reproductive rights. But she does ask, what about protests and the civil disobedience type of actions? Do you still see a big place for that in our future? I can't imagine now never having a big that being an important thing for us.
I think it's so important. I will leave it to you and Christian to determine where Now puts its boots on the ground, but I think it's more important than ever. And, one of the things that Black Lives Matter did so well in bringing out protests was to have very specific demands. I was at a protest at Grand Army Plaza, and it said repeal 50A, which is a reporting on police misconduct statute or something that got in the way of that. And I think, defund the police, repeal 50A. We need to have similar, pass the Pregnant Workers Protection Act, pass the Women's Health Equality Act. We need really specific demands to go along with our protests. I think one of the things that the women's rights movement has done and the Women's March done is brought, tens of thousands of millions of people out in the streets over the years, and it's been fantastic. And when you look at what's going on in Poland and Argentina and other places, they're bringing people out with a very specific demand to decriminalize abortion, to secure our rights. It's got to be go time for us now on these issues. we can't save Roe at this point. Roe can't save itself. The Supreme Court is not our friend. So we need to ask what's next. What can we get at the federal level? What can we get from our states? What can we even get from our city council members? And write it on your sign and demand it, and start demanding that businesses and corporations and people who get our dollars do the same thing, that they need to join us, and that our allies do as well. And I like a good march on a sunny day. I hate it when it rains. I hate it when it's cold. But I always love it with a friend or a daughter, or, even a mother brought along too. I think it continues to be important.
Yeah, once again, I agree. I would say that, and I always encourage people, like, we have to think about what's our intended outcome, and then what are the steps it's going to take us to get to the intended outcome. And so if we want, if we're rallying because we want this, but what else in that rally, right? So what else in that action? So what are we doing to lead? What steps we need to take with that? It's not just the rally. That's one coordinated effort, but there's lots of other parts and things that we can do to work toward our intended outcome. And I always tell people too, not everybody's a person that goes out to marches and rallies. That's for some people. Some people like to write letters. Some people like to have meetings. It's all important parts that we need to get together to put together to go for our intended outcome. But we have to be very strategic, and we have to have strategy, and we have to have a very, very clear plan so that we can get to our accomplished goal. And understanding it can take time to do it.
Thank you so much, both of you, Julie and Christian. We're so thankful and grateful for your insight and all the tenacious dedication that you put towards your work and to protecting our reproductive rights. I hope everybody will go to Amazon and get Julie and Kitty's book, Controlling Women. It's a fascinating read, puts everything into perspective about just the major Supreme Court cases and all of the human rights approach that we've talked about today, and some great action items that you can take. And her main point is do something. And as Christian just said, and made the point, maybe it's not being out on the front lines on a march, but find what works for you and do something.